One decision. 5 seconds. Two broken lives forever changed. On Christmas Eve in Chicago, a successful real estate developer made a choice that most people wouldn't make. He stopped his car. He got out in the freezing cold, and he approached a homeless woman digging through garbage behind a restaurant. What she said to him would haunt him, humble him, and ultimately heal him. This isn't a story about charity. It's not about money saving the day. This is a story about what happens when someone truly sees another human being. When compassion becomes more than a word and turns into action. My name is telling you this story because it needs to be told. Because somewhere right now, someone is driving past another person's pain. Someone is looking away. Someone is choosing comfort over connection. And this story is a reminder that the smallest moments can carry the greatest weight.
So stay with me until the end.
Because what happens 1 year later will show you that kindness doesn't just change one life. It creates ripples that touch everyone around it. If stories about humanity, hope, and the power of one good choice move your heart, please take a second to like this video and subscribe. Every click helps keep stories like this alive. Now let me tell you what really happened. Welcome to the story room. While you are here, please hit the subscribe button and comment your view on the story and where you're watching from. James Cooper gripped the steering wheel of his Range Rover as Christmas lights blurred past his window, the streets of downtown Chicago dressed up in holiday magic that felt hollow to him tonight. To the world, James was living the dream. Self-made millionaire. Owner of Cooper Properties, one of the most successful real estate development companies in the Midwest. Featured in business magazines. Invited to exclusive charity galas. The kind of success story people admired from a distance. But inside the quiet leather interior of his expensive car, James was just a widowed father trying to get home before his 7-year-old daughter fell asleep waiting for him. Again. On the passenger seat sat a small gift bag, hastily wrapped by the store clerk because James had forgotten to do it himself. Next to it lay a paper snowflake his daughter Lucy had made at school. She'd asked him 3 times this week to hang it on the window together, and 3 times James had promised tomorrow. Tomorrow kept getting pushed back by meetings that ran late, deals that needed closing, calls that couldn't wait. His wife, Rachel, had died 2 years ago. Cancer. Fast and cruel. She'd made him promise just one thing as she lay in that hospital bed, her hand weak in his. Don't let work swallow you, James. Don't let Lucy grow up with a father who's always gone. He'd promised. God, how he'd promised. But grief had a way of making you hide. And work was the perfect hiding place. Numbers didn't hurt. Contracts didn't cry. Buildings didn't remind you of the person-shaped hole in your life. The traffic light ahead turned red, and James slowed to a stop. That's when he saw her. Under a flickering streetlight, behind a closed Italian restaurant, a woman was kneeling in the snow beside a dumpster. Her hands, bare and red from the cold, were digging through garbage. She wore an oversized coat that had seen better years. Mismatched boots. A knit hat that didn't quite cover her dark, tangled hair. Snow clung to her shoulders like she'd been out there for hours. James felt his chest tighten. That uncomfortable feeling he usually pushed away. That reminder that the world was full of pain he couldn't fix. He'd written plenty of checks to homeless shelters, donated to food banks, put his name on buildings that helped people. But this was different. This was close. This was real. This was a human being 20 feet away from him, suffering in the cold while he sat in heated leather seats. His daughter's voice echoed in his mind from earlier that morning. She'd been watching a Christmas movie, and during a commercial about toys for kids in need, she'd turned to him with those big, serious eyes. "Daddy, does Santa visit people who don't have homes?" The question had stopped him cold. He'd mumbled something vague about how Santa tries to help everyone, but Lucy had pressed. How does he find them if they don't have addresses? James hadn't known what to say. So he'd changed the subject, promising they'd talk about it later. Now, sitting at this red light, that question refused to let him go. He told himself he was already late. That stopping would complicate things. That someone else would help her, someone better equipped, someone trained for this. But even as he thought it, he knew it was an excuse. The kind of excuse he'd gotten good at making. The light turned green. Cars behind him started honking. James made a decision. He pulled over to the curb, ignoring the angry horns and gestures from other drivers. He turned off the engine and sat there for a moment, his heart pounding. What was he doing? He didn't know how to help a homeless person. He wasn't a social worker. He was a businessman who built condos and office buildings. But Rachel's voice whispered in his memory. The hardest thing and the right thing are usually the same thing, James. He grabbed his wallet and stepped out into the December cold. The wind bit through his expensive wool coat immediately, and he couldn't imagine how the woman survived in what she was wearing. The crunch of his dress shoes on the snow sounded too loud as he approached the alley. The woman didn't look up at first, her focus entirely on the dumpster, searching for something with desperate concentration. James cleared his throat, suddenly aware of how out of place he looked. How privileged. How insufficient. "Excuse me," he said, his voice gentler than he'd expected. The woman froze. Then slowly, she turned her head. Her face was pale from the cold, her cheeks hollowed by hunger, her eyes shadowed by exhaustion. But there was something else in those eyes. Something sharp and unbroken. She didn't look ashamed. She didn't look defeated. She looked tired of being invisible. James opened his mouth, reaching into his wallet for the bills he always carried, the universal solution he'd relied on for years. Money fixed problems. Money made things better. Before he could say a word, she spoke. "I'm not stealing." The sentence hit James like a physical blow. He stopped mid-motion, the cash still in his hand, his breath catching in his throat. He hadn't accused her of anything, but her words revealed how many times the world already had. I didn't think you were," James stammered, lowering his hand, suddenly feeling like the money in his palm was an insult rather than help. She looked back at the dumpster, her voice quieter now but steady. "I'm looking for something. Something important." James hesitated, then asked the question that would change everything. What could be that important? The woman paused, as if deciding whether this stranger in an expensive coat deserved the truth. Then she answered in a whisper that carried more weight than the falling snow. "A drawing. My daughter made it for me." The world seemed to stop. The traffic noise faded. The cold disappeared. All James could hear was the echo of those words. My daughter. He thought of Lucy's artwork covering their refrigerator at home. Stick figures holding hands. Crooked houses with two big suns. Hearts and stars and messages written in careful, shaky letters. He thought about what it would feel like to lose one of those drawings. To have nothing left of your child except a piece of paper thrown away in the trash. His throat tightened. "I'll help you look." The woman's eyes widened in surprise. "You don't have to." But James was already kneeling beside her in the snow, his expensive pants soaking through, his hands reaching into the garbage, without hesitation. They searched together in silence. Two strangers from completely different worlds, connected by something neither of them had planned. After what felt like both seconds and hours, the woman let out a sharp gasp. Her trembling hands pulled out a folded, stained piece of paper. She smoothed it out carefully, like it was made of glass. Like it was the most precious thing in the world. The drawing showed a woman and a small girl holding hands under a Christmas tree. A bright star shone above them. On the back, in a child's handwriting, were the words, "Mommy, you are my home." The woman pressed the paper to her chest and broke. Sobs shook her shoulders. Tears streamed down her frozen cheeks. All the strength she'd been holding onto crumbled in that moment. James felt his own eyes burn. He looked away, giving her privacy, giving her space to feel everything she'd been holding back. When she finally caught her breath, she wiped her face with her sleeve and looked at James with raw honesty. "She's not with me anymore," she said quietly. "I lost my job. Then my apartment. Everything fell apart so fast. They took her into foster care 3 months ago. Tonight was my turn to sleep outside." James felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. "I'm so sorry." The woman shook her head. "I don't want sorry. Sorry doesn't change anything." She was right. And James knew it. They knelt there together in the snow, the city moving around them, oblivious to the moment unfolding in that alley. And James realized that this night was only just beginning. They remained kneeling there in the snow for a long moment, the woman clutching her daughter's drawing like a lifeline while James stayed beside her, unsure whether to speak or simply be present in her pain. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was heavy with everything she'd lost and everything he'd never had to fear losing. Finally, she wiped her eyes and took a shaky breath, steadying herself with visible effort. "I'm sorry you had to see that," she said, her voice tight. "People don't usually stop. When they do, they look at me like I'm broken, like I'm something that needs fixing or avoiding." James shook his head, his throat too tight for smooth words. "I don't see someone broken. I see someone having the worst night of her life." She studied him for a moment, testing whether kindness like that could be trusted. Then she nodded once.
"My name is Isabel," she said.
"I wasn't always here." James. He felt oddly exposed saying just his first name, without the title or company attached. "I'm a father," he added, unsure why it felt important for her to know. Something shifted in Isabel's expression. A flicker of understanding passed through her exhausted eyes. "Then you know," she said quietly. "You know how fast everything falls apart when you're just trying to hold on for your child." Snow continued to fall around them, settling on their shoulders like the night itself was bearing witness. James offered the money again, slower this time, not as a solution but as anything to help. Isabel looked at the bills, then shook her head gently. "I don't want it to end like this. Like I'm just a problem someone paid to forget." The word stung, because James knew exactly how true they were. He slipped the money back into his pocket, nodding. "Then let me do something else," he said. "Let me at least get you something warm."
"Food. Coffee."
"Please." Isabel hesitated, pride warring with hunger and cold. But a shiver running through her body made the decision. "Okay. And if you're enjoying this story so far, you'll want to subscribe, because this is only the beginning." They walked together toward a small diner still glowing with light at the end of the block. The bell above the door rang softly as they stepped inside, and warmth wrapped around them instantly. Isabel flinched, as if her body had forgotten what comfort felt like. James noticed the way other customers glanced at her worn clothes, then at him in his expensive coat, confusion flickering across their faces. He ignored them completely, guiding Isabel to a booth in the back. He ordered without asking soup, sandwiches, hot coffee, trusting that warmth and food were universal needs. As they sat there waiting, steam rising from their cups, Isabel stared at the table for a long time before speaking. "I used to work at a nursing home," she said slowly, her voice careful, like she was testing whether these memories still belonged to her. "I helped people who couldn't help themselves. Fed them, bathed them, held their hands when they were scared." She paused, her fingers wrapped around the warm mug. "I thought if you worked hard and stayed kind, life would meet you halfway." A bitter laugh escaped her. "Then my husband left. No warning. Just emptied our bank account and disappeared. Medical bills from when my daughter was sick started piling up. I missed one rent payment. Then another. One bad month turned into a bad year." James listened, his phone forgotten in his pocket, the outside world reduced to nothing but her voice and the truth it carried. "People think homelessness is a choice," Isabel continued. "They don't see the 100 small disasters that lead you here. The car that breaks down. The daycare that won't take your kid without insurance. The job that fires you when you miss work because you have nowhere to leave your child." Her eyes met his. "They don't see how you fight every single day until fighting stops being enough." James felt something inside him crack open. He told her about Rachel, about the night she died, about holding Lucy afterward and promising he'd never let her feel alone, even though he felt alone every single day. Isabel's expression softened. "Your daughter is lucky to have someone who stops." The words hit James harder than he expected. When the food arrived, Isabel ate slowly, like she was afraid it might disappear if she moved too fast. James barely touched his own meal, too aware of the contrast between them. As the evening wore on, the question hung between them, unspoken but growing heavier. Outside, the night was still cold, and James knew exactly where Isabel would go if he walked her back to that alley. His heart pounded as responsibility battled caution, as compassion fought against every reasonable voice in his head telling him not to get involved. "I have a guest room," he finally said, the words tumbling out before fear could stop them. "Just for tonight. No expectations. You can leave in the morning if you want." Isabel stiffened immediately, fear flashing across her face. "I don't want charity." "Then don't take it as charity," James replied. "Take it as shelter. One human helping another on Christmas Eve." She searched his face for a long time, looking for motives, for danger, for the catch that always seemed to come. Finally, she exhaled slowly. One night. Just one. The drive to James's house was quiet, snow turning the streetlights into soft halos as the weight of what he was doing settled onto his shoulders. What if this was a mistake? What if something went wrong? What if Lucy was scared? But deeper than the fear was something else. A certainty that this was right. That this was what Rachel would have done without hesitation. When they pulled up to the house, warm light glowed from the windows. The Christmas tree was visible through the glass, decorated with ornaments Lucy had made over the years. Inside, Lucy was still awake, sitting cross-legged on the floor in her pajamas, waiting like she did every night. She looked up as the door opened, her eyes widening with curiosity when she saw Isabel. James's heart skipped. "Lucy, this is Isabel. She's going to stay with us tonight." Before he could explain further, Lucy stood up and walked over, holding the paper snowflake she'd been clutching all evening. "Merry Christmas," Lucy said simply, offering the snowflake to Isabel. Isabel knelt down, her hands shaking as she accepted it. Tears streamed down her face as she whispered, "Thank you, sweetheart. Thank you." Lucy looked up at her father, confused. "Why is she crying, Daddy?" James knelt too, his arm around Lucy. "Because sometimes kindness makes us cry. The good kind of crying." In that moment, watching his daughter's simple generosity and Isabel's overwhelming gratitude, James understood something profound. The hardest part of helping wasn't the money or the inconvenience. It was allowing yourself to truly see another person's humanity and letting them see yours in return. The house felt different that night, as if the walls themselves were absorbing the quiet miracle unfolding within them, and James sensed it the moment he closed the door, shutting out the cold and the life he thought he understood. Isabel stood in the entryway, clutching the paper snowflake and her daughter's drawing, her shoulders tense like she might be asked to leave at any moment. Lucy hovered nearby, watching Isabel with the unfiltered curiosity only children have, no judgment in her eyes, just questions she was too polite to ask. "You can hang your coat here," James said gently, gesturing to the rack by the door. Isabel followed his instruction carefully, every movement slow and respectful, as if afraid to disturb the warmth surrounding her. The living room glowed with soft lights from the Christmas tree, ornaments reflecting years of memories, Rachel's favorites, Lucy's handmade creations, traditions that had survived loss. Isabel's eyes lingered on them, not with envy, but with aching nostalgia for the life she used to have. James showed her to the guest room upstairs. Simple but clean. Fresh sheets. A door that locked from the inside. When Isabel saw it, she pressed her hand to her mouth, overwhelmed by something as ordinary as privacy and safety. "Just rest," James said quietly. "Nothing else matters tonight." She nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. As James stepped back into the hallway, relief and fear mixed in his chest. Relief that she was safe. Fear of what morning might bring. Downstairs, Lucy tugged on his sleeve. "Daddy, is she okay?" James knelt, meeting his daughter's concerned eyes. "She's had a very hard time, sweetheart. But tonight, she's safe. And sometimes that's enough." Lucy nodded solemnly, processing this with the seriousness she gave to important matters. "We should hang the snowflake where she can see it tomorrow." James felt his chest tighten. Together, they placed it on the window beside the tree, the familiar ritual feeling brand new. That night, long after Lucy fell asleep, James sat alone in the living room, the events of the evening replaying in his mind like a movie he couldn't pause. He thought about how easily he could have driven past, how close Isabel had been to remaining invisible, how many times he probably had driven past people who needed help. The realization unsettled him deeply. Upstairs, Isabel lay awake in the guest bed, staring at the ceiling. The mattress felt almost frightening in its comfort after months of sleeping on concrete, in shelters, in her car before it was towed. She clutched her daughter's drawing, tears slipping silently down her temples, overwhelmed by the simple fact that someone had chosen not to turn away. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by dreams of doorways closing and opening, of her daughter's voice calling for her just out of reach. Morning arrived gently, winter sunlight filtering through curtains, and for a moment Isabel forgot where she was. Panic rose until memory returned. The alley, the diner, the man who stopped. She sat up slowly, listening. The house was quiet but not empty. Downstairs, the smell of coffee and something cooking drifted upward. When she finally came down, James greeted her with a careful smile, not wanting to overwhelm. "Morning. I hope you slept okay." "Better than I have in months," Isabel admitted quietly. Lucy sat at the kitchen table, drawing intently. She looked up when Isabel entered. "I made another snowflake. This one's for your daughter." Isabel's breath caught. She blinked rapidly, forcing herself not to cry again, but failing. Over breakfast, conversation flowed gently. No pressure. No interrogation. James asked about Isabel's daughter. Her name was Sophie. She was 6. She loved butterflies and the color purple. Isabel's voice grew steadier with each memory shared, as if speaking them aloud made them real again. Afterward, Isabel stood by the window, looking out at the snow-covered yard. "I should go. I don't want to overstay." James shook his head. "There's no rush. But I won't pretend one night solves everything." He hesitated, then continued carefully. "If you're willing, I'd like to help you figure out next steps. Not handouts. Real help. Support while you get back on your feet." Isabel studied him, weighing trust against survival, hope against the fear of being disappointed again. "I don't want shortcuts," she said firmly. "I want my daughter back. I want to stand on my own." "I respect that," James replied. "I'm not offering to fix your life. I'm offering to stand beside you while you fix it yourself." Over the next several days, James helped Isabel make calls, connected her with social services, found her temporary work through his company's community outreach program. He was careful to keep his involvement quiet, never using his influence to push her ahead unfairly, just opening doors she couldn't reach on her own. Isabel worked tirelessly, arriving early to every shift, staying late, refusing any special treatment, determined to rebuild with her own hands. James watched from a distance, humbled by her strength and resilience. Lucy asked about Isabel every evening. "Is she okay, Daddy? When is she coming back?" The questions reminded James that kindness had already taken root in their home, changing not just Isabel's life, but theirs too. One evening, as Isabel prepared to leave for the small efficiency apartment the social services program had arranged, she tried to return the paper snowflake. "I want you to keep this," she said. "So you remember." James shook his head gently. "You keep it. You need reminders more than I do. Reminders that people care." Isabel smiled then, a real smile, small but genuine. "You didn't just help me, James. You saw me. There's a difference." In that moment, James understood that this chapter wasn't about rescue anymore. It was about resilience, about the quiet courage it takes to begin again when the world has knocked you down. Winter stretched on, cold but no longer cruel, and something fundamental had shifted in James's life that he couldn't quite name but felt in every moment. He was becoming the father Rachel had asked him to be. The man who didn't just write checks but showed up. Who didn't just donate but participated. And it had started with 5 seconds. One decision. The choice to stop. Months passed, and James discovered that helping someone wasn't a single act but a sustained commitment, a marathon rather than a sprint, filled with setbacks, small victories, and lessons he never expected to learn. Isabel no longer stayed in the guest room, having moved into her small apartment, but she visited often, sometimes for dinner, sometimes just to talk, and every time she walked through the door, Lucy greeted her like family. Isabel never arrived empty-handed, even when she had almost nothing to give. Sometimes it was discount bread from the bakery where she worked mornings. Sometimes it was just her presence, steady and sincere. James noticed how Lucy listened when Isabel spoke, absorbing her words about patience, about not giving up even when everything felt impossible. And James realized that kindness, once shown, taught lessons no amount of money ever could. Isabel's days were full now. Early morning shifts at the bakery, afternoons at a cleaning company, evenings spent at required meetings for the reunification program, weekends volunteering when she could, determined to prove to the system and to herself that she was capable. There were setbacks, of course. Paperwork lost in bureaucratic shuffles. Appointments delayed. Caseworkers who changed without warning, forcing her to start over-explaining her story. Moments when exhaustion threatened to undo everything. But each time she stumbled, she picked herself back up with quiet strength that humbled everyone who witnessed it. James supported from the sidelines, learning the delicate balance of helping without controlling, of being available without being intrusive.
He helped when asked,
Stepped back when needed, and discovered how difficult it was to truly help without trying to fix everything. One evening, Isabel arrived late, her shoulders slumped, eyes shadowed with fresh disappointment. She sat at the kitchen table and stared at her hands for a long time before speaking. "They postponed my custody review," she said softly. "Another 3 months. They said I need to show more stability." James felt anger rise on her behalf, but Isabel lifted her head and met his gaze with determination. "I'm tired," she admitted, "but I'm not quitting. Not ever." Her resolve filled the room, and James felt something shift inside himself, understanding that strength didn't always roar. Sometimes it whispered, and kept going anyway. As weeks passed, new rituals developed in the house. Shared meals where everyone contributed something, even if Isabel's contribution was just setting the table. Quiet evenings where Lucy read aloud while Isabel listened, storing away the sound for harder days. One night, as snow fell gently outside, Isabel confessed something she'd never said aloud. "The night you found me," she began, her voice careful, "I wasn't just cold or hungry. I was afraid I was disappearing. Like if no one saw me, I might stop existing altogether." James didn't interrupt, sensing the weight of the moment. "When you stopped your car," Isabel continued, "when you got out and talked to me like I was a person and not a problem, it reminded me that I was still here. Still real. Still worth something." James nodded slowly, understanding that the simplest choices often carried the greatest impact. Spring approached, tentative and hopeful, bringing with it news Isabel had been desperately waiting for: approval for supervised visits with Sophie. The day of the first visit, Isabel's hands shook as she prepared, smoothing her clothes obsessively, checking her reflection again and again, terrified of doing something wrong. James drove her to the visitation center in silence, offering presence rather than empty reassurance. When Isabel returned 3 hours later, tears streamed down her face, but these were different tears. "She remembered me," Isabel whispered, her voice breaking. "She ran into my arms. She told me she missed me every single day." James felt his own eyes burn as he listened, sharing in a joy that felt earned rather than given. That night, they celebrated quietly. Lucy made a welcome home card for Sophie, even though Sophie wouldn't see it yet. Isabel cried again, good tears this time, grateful tears. "You didn't save me," Isabel said, looking at James with clear eyes. "You stood with me while I saved myself. There's a difference." James absorbed the words, realizing how much he'd learned in the process. About humility, about patience, about the difference between charity and solidarity. The following weeks brought more progress. Steady employment, positive reports from caseworkers, supervised visits that gradually extended longer, cautious optimism from the system that had been so rigid before. And while the road ahead remained long, hope had taken root where despair once lived. James found himself changed too. More attentive, more aware of the invisible struggles happening around him every day. He stopped more often now, for the person asking for directions who looked lost in more ways than one. For the struggling parent in line at the grocery store. For anyone the world seemed to be rushing past. He understood now that wealth had never been about accumulation. It was about responsibility, about seeing the people others ignored and choosing, again and again, to slow down. His company launched a new initiative, transitional housing for homeless families. Not because it was good PR, but because James had seen firsthand how one safe place could change everything. Isabel was consulted on every detail, her experience valued, her voice heard. As she prepared for the next phase of her journey, moving toward full reunification with Sophie, James felt both pride and humility. Pride in her strength, humility in recognizing that he'd received far more than he'd given. The greatest gift that Christmas Eve wasn't the chance to help. It was the chance to be transformed by compassion, patience, and the quiet power of shared humanity. Rachel would have been proud, he thought. Not of the money he spent or the connections he made, but of the fact that he'd finally learned to stop.
To see. To stay.
And in doing so, he'd become the father, the man, she'd always believed he could be. A full year passed, and when Christmas Eve returned, it felt nothing like the one before. Not because the city had changed, but because James had, and he noticed at the moment snow began to fall again, soft and deliberate, coating Chicago's streets in the same quiet promise he once would have driven past without seeing. The paper snowflake still hung in his window, slightly faded now, but James refused to take it down. It reminded him of a night when life asked him a question he couldn't ignore, and for once, he'd answered correctly. Earlier that evening, Lucy stood beside him, taller now at 8, carefully wrapping a small gift with focused concentration. "It's for Sophie," she announced proudly. "She likes butterflies. I made sure it had butterflies." James smiled, a deep, grateful smile that carried a year's worth of lessons learned the hard way. Isabel was no longer a visitor in their lives. She was woven into their story, part of their family in every way that mattered. She'd moved into a modest but warm 2-bedroom apartment 4 months earlier, and after countless meetings, reviews, and sleepless nights of proving herself, she had regained full custody of Sophie. The day she called James with the news, her voice shaking with disbelief and joy, he'd pulled his car over, just like that first night, overwhelmed by happiness that wasn't his own but felt just as powerful. Now, on this Christmas Eve, James drove the same route where everything had begun. Slower than traffic demanded, his eyes scanning the sidewalks near the alley behind the Italian restaurant, he saw something new. Lights strung carefully along the brick walls. Volunteers in bright vests handing out warm meals and blankets. Laughter and conversation where once there had been only silence and suffering. Isabel stood there, bundled in a coat that fit properly now, Sophie's small hand tucked securely in hers. When she saw James's car pull up, her face lit with a smile that carried survival, strength, and peace all at once. They greeted each other warmly, no words needed at first, because the past no longer hurt the way it once had. It had transformed into something solid and meaningful. As they walked together, Sophie chattered excitedly about school, about her new room, about how Christmas felt different when you knew where you were sleeping tonight. James listened, humbled by the simplicity of security, by how much others took for granted. Later, as volunteers continued their work serving those still struggling, Isabel turned to James, her voice thoughtful. "People always ask me what changed everything," she said. James waited, knowing the answer mattered. "They expect me to say money or luck or connections," Isabel continued, looking back toward the alley now filled with light instead of despair. "But that's not what changed everything." She met his eyes. "What changed everything was that you stopped. And you saw me." James felt the familiar tightness in his chest, but this time it wasn't pain. It was understanding. "Before that night," Isabel said quietly, "I felt invisible. And when you're invisible long enough, you start believing you don't matter, that you're not worth seeing. She paused, watching Sophie play with Lucy nearby. When I said, I'm not stealing, what I really meant was, I'm still a person. I needed someone to see that. James nodded slowly, the weight of her words settling into him the way truth always did, quietly, permanently. As the evening continued, they exchanged gifts. Simple ones, chosen with care rather than cost. James watched Lucy kneel to give Sophie the wrapped package. When Sophie opened it and found a delicate butterfly necklace inside, her face lit up with wonder. She threw her arms around Lucy, and both girls dissolved into giggles. In that moment, James saw how far the ripples of one decision could travel. How a single pause in the rush of life could echo across time, touching people he would never fully know. On the drive home, Lucy grew quiet, staring out at the falling snow. Daddy, she said softly, remember last year when I asked if Santa comes to everyone? James smiled, remembering the question that started everything. I do, sweetheart. I think I know the answer now, Lucy continued. Santa looks like people who choose to care. Like you did. James's eyes burned with tears he didn't hide. That's exactly right, Lucy. Exactly right. That night, after Lucy fell asleep clutching the card Sophie had made for her, James stood by the window, looking out at the stars barely visible through the city lights. He thought about success, about how he once measured it in square footage and profit margins, in buildings that bore his name and deals that made headlines, and how incomplete those measures felt now. He understood that real wealth wasn't found in what you owned, but in what you were willing to give, your time, your attention, your humanity to someone who needed it. Somewhere across the city, Isabel and Sophie were falling asleep together under the same roof, safe and seen and hopeful. And James knew that while he hadn't saved anyone, he'd been part of something far greater, a chain of kindness that refused to break, that kept extending forward into the world. As Christmas Eve slipped quietly into Christmas morning, James made a silent promise to himself.
To keep stopping. To keep seeing.
To never underestimate the power of one small act done at exactly the right moment. Because a year ago, he'd been a man who had everything and felt empty. Now he was a man who understood that the greatest gift you can give isn't money or possessions. It's presence. It's witness. It's the willingness to see another person's humanity and honor it with your own. The paper snowflake glowed softly in the window, a reminder that miracles don't always come from heaven. Sometimes they come from strangers who choose to care, who show up when they don't have to, who see suffering and refuse. Thanks for your watching. Don't forget to share, like, and subscribe to the Story Room for meaningful stories that inspire and teach life lessons.